The Grand Plaza Hotel in Manhattan was about to experience the most embarrassing moment in its century-long history. Kenji Nakamura, Japanese tech billionaire and guest of the presidential suite at $15,000 per night, was trapped in the 7th-floor hallway with a medical emergency. His 80-year-old father was having a cardiac episode in the suite, and Kenji was desperately shouting for help in Japanese. The general manager, concierge, staff in tailored uniforms, nobody understood a word. They pressed buttons, made calls, but the language barrier turned precious seconds into minutes of chaos. Then, from the far corner of the hallway, appeared a woman in a blue cleaning uniform, pushing a cart loaded with towels and cleaning supplies. Sarah Martinez, 52 years old, cleaning lady for 20 years, invisible to the eyes of high society that frequented the hotel. She approached Kenji and with a calm, clear voice responded in perfect Japanese. The silence that followed was absolute. The billionaire looked at her as if he'd seen a miracle. The staff stood with mouths open. Because that cleaning lady, whom everyone treated as invisible, knew a language that no hotel manager spoke, and the story she was about to tell would shame everyone present for how they had judged her. The Grand Plaza Hotel rose majestically on Fifth Avenue, a 7-story Beaux-Arts building that had hosted heads of state, movie stars, and finance moguls since 1920. Its suites cost more than most Americans earned in a month. Its hallways smelled of discreet luxury. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers. Sarah Martinez had 52 years and 20 years of work in that hotel. Every morning at 5:30, she took the subway from Queens, crossed Manhattan still asleep, entered through the staff entrance, and put on her blue uniform. Then, with her cart, she began her round of rooms, made beds, cleaned bathrooms, replaced towels, emptied trash. She was invisible. Guests looked at her without seeing her. Managers gave her orders without looking her in the eyes. She was just the cleaning lady on the 7th floor, a number on the attendance sheet, a line item in the operating budget. But Sarah had a story that nobody knew. Nobody had ever asked. That Tuesday morning in May, while restocking her cart in the 7th-floor storage room, she heard unusual commotion in the hallway. Agitated voices, hurried footsteps, the tone of panic she recognized after 20 years of hotel work. She cautiously looked out. In the center of the hallway stood a Japanese man in his 50s, dressed in an impeccable dark suit, gesticulating desperately while speaking loudly in Japanese. Next to him were the hotel manager, 2 concierges in livery, an assistant with a tablet. Everyone seemed panicked. The Japanese man, Sarah recognized Kenji Nakamura, the billionaire who had occupied the presidential suite for 3 days, kept speaking rapidly, pointing at his suite door. His face was pale, hands trembling. The manager tried to calm the situation in broken English, but it was evident they didn't understand what Nakamura was saying. One concierge frantically called someone on the phone, probably searching for an interpreter. The other attempted to use a translation app, with poor results. Sarah immediately understood what Kenji was saying. His father, in the suite, was having a medical emergency. Chest pain, difficulty breathing. Needed a doctor, now. But nobody understood. Precious seconds were lost in confusion. The manager had grasped there was an emergency, but didn't know what kind. The frustration on Kenji's face grew every second. Sarah hesitated. She was just the cleaning lady. It wasn't her job to intervene in situations with VIP guests. Protocol was clear. Low-level staff should remain invisible, especially in the presence of important clients. But there was an elderly man possibly having a heart attack a few feet away. And she understood perfectly what his son was saying. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She left the cart, crossed the hallway, and approached the group. The manager looked at her with annoyance. What was the cleaning lady doing in the middle of a crisis with a billionaire guest? But, before he could send her away, Sarah looked Kenji straight in the eyes and spoke in fluent, clear Japanese. The silence that followed was absolute. Kenji stared at her as if he'd seen an apparition. The manager opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The concierges froze. Sarah continued speaking in Japanese, asking Kenji to describe his father's symptoms. He responded quickly, words now flowing with evident relief. Pain in the left chest, sweating, nausea. 80 years old, history of heart problems. Sarah turned to the manager and translated rapidly. Possible heart attack. Need ambulance immediately. 7th floor, presidential suite. Patient is an 80-year-old man with cardiac history. The manager, still in shock, finally managed to react. He ordered the concierge to call 911, gave precise instructions. In less than 2 minutes, the ambulance had been alerted with all necessary details. Sarah entered the presidential suite, an environment she normally cleaned but never inhabited, and found Mr. Nakamura Sr. sitting in an armchair, pale and sweating. Calmly, she spoke to him in Japanese, reassured him, helped him into a better position, loosened his tie. 20 years of experience had taught her the basics of first aid. When the paramedics arrived, Sarah translated the medical information Kenji provided, facilitating a rapid and effective intervention. Mr. Nakamura was taken away in the ambulance, stabilized. Kenji followed, but before leaving, he stopped in front of Sarah and, in Japanese, told her he owed his father's life to her. Sarah simply replied she was glad she could help. Then, as Kenji left with the paramedics, she returned to her cart as if nothing had happened. But in the 7th floor hallway of the Grand Plaza Hotel, everything had changed. The manager and concierges looked at her with expressions oscillating between shock and shame. For 20 years they had worked alongside this woman without ever asking her a personal question, without ever seeing her as anything more than a cleaning lady. And now they discovered she spoke Japanese fluently. The question nobody had ever asked was finally emerging. Who really was Sarah Martinez? The hotel manager, Mr. Richard Stevens, sat in his office with a thoughtful expression. In front of him was Sarah Martinez's personnel file, a thin document, hire date, annual evaluations always perfect, 0 unexcused absences, 0 complaints, but nothing about where she'd learned Japanese, nothing about her life before the hotel. Richard realized with embarrassment he'd never spoken with Sarah except to give work instructions. In 15 years, he'd never asked her anything personal. She was simply there, reliable, silent, invisible. That evening, when the hospital confirmed Mr. Nakamura was stable, a minor heart attack, caught in time, Kenji returned to the hotel and immediately asked to speak with Sarah. But it was her afternoon shift, and she'd already left. Kenji asked the manager for information about her. Richard had to admit with shame he knew very little. Kenji looked at him with disappointment and said something that struck Richard deeply. In Japan, even those who clean floors are treated with respect and dignity. How can a luxury hotel not know the people who work for it? The following morning, when Sarah arrived at 5:30 as always, Richard was waiting. He asked if they could talk. Sarah, surprised and worried, followed him to his office. Richard began with a sincere admission. He apologized for never asking about her life, for treating her as invisible. Then he asked if she felt comfortable to tell him how a cleaning lady from Queens had learned to speak Japanese so perfectly. Sarah hesitated. She wasn't used to being seen, much less being heard, but there was something genuine in Richard's eyes, a humility she'd never seen before. So she began to tell. Her story started 30 years ago. At 22, she was a brilliant student at Columbia University, specializing in East Asian languages. She'd always had a talent for languages, and Japanese had fascinated her. She graduated with honors, spoke Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. Her dream was to work as an interpreter, maybe at the UN, or for large international companies. Then her father became gravely ill, lung cancer, aggressive. Her mother had already died. She was an only child. There was nobody else. Sarah interrupted her graduate studies to take care of him. She thought it was temporary, but the illness lasted 3 years. Savings ran out. She had to sell the family apartment to pay for treatments. When her father died, Sarah was 25 years old. 0 savings, no place to live, and a resume with a 3-year gap. Companies looking for interpreters wanted young recent graduates or professionals with experience. She was neither. She looked for work for months without success. She needed to eat, needed to pay rent, so she accepted a temporary job as a cleaning lady. Temporary became permanent. Years passed. Opportunities disappeared. She simply became the cleaning lady. Her degrees, her language skills, her dreams, all hidden under a blue uniform. But she never stopped studying. At home, in her free time, she continued reading in Japanese, watching films, staying updated. Not because she thought it would be useful, but because she loved that language, that culture. It was the only thing remaining from her dreams. Richard listened in silence, his face increasingly somber. When Sarah finished, he recognized he'd wasted an incredible talent by letting it clean rooms for 20 years. Sarah smiled sadly. It wasn't his fault. It was circumstances. Life sometimes takes unexpected directions. But Richard shook his head. He wanted to make amends. The hotel needed someone who spoke Japanese, especially considering Japanese tourists were constantly increasing. He offered her a new role, assistant for Asian client relations. Double salary, her own office, no more carts. Sarah was speechless. After 20 years of invisibility, suddenly she was seen. After 20 years of silence, suddenly she was heard. Kenji Nakamura returned to the hotel 3 days later, when his father was discharged from the hospital. He immediately asked for Sarah, wanting to thank her personally. When he saw her, he did something unexpected. He bowed deeply, a sign of profound respect in Japanese culture. In Japanese, he told her his father was alive because of her, that her speed had made the difference between life and death. He wanted to reward her adequately.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Sarah, embarrassed, replied she'd only done what anyone should do. But Kenji insisted. At minimum, he wanted to take her to dinner and learn her story. That evening, at an elegant Japanese restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, Sarah told her story. Kenji listened with deep attention, then told his son of a small merchant he'd built a tech empire starting from nothing. He understood what it meant to struggle, sacrifice, see one's dreams seem impossible. In the following days, while his father recovered, Kenji did something extraordinary. His company was expanding in the United States and was looking for someone to manage relations with American partners, someone who understood both cultures, both languages, both mentalities. He offered Sarah the job. Salary 6 times what she earned at the hotel. Full benefits. Office in Manhattan. Sarah was overwhelmed. After 20 years of invisibility, suddenly 2 extraordinary job offers in 1 week. But there was something deeper at play. Richard had started a silent revolution. After discovering Sarah's story, he'd begun talking with other staff members who had always been invisible. The cleaning lady on the 3rd floor spoke perfect Russian. The dishwasher had an engineering degree, but had never found work in his field. The night porter wrote poetry published under a pseudonym. Every person had a story. Every person had hidden talents. And for years, the hotel had simply ignored them. Richard created a new program, Internal Staff Development. Discover hidden talents and utilize them. The woman who spoke Russian became the liaison for Eastern European clients. The engineer dishwasher was moved to technical maintenance. The poet porter started writing the hotel descriptions for the website. Sarah decided to accept Kenji's offer. It was an opportunity she couldn't refuse. But before leaving the hotel, she did something important. She spoke with all the staff, told her story, encouraged others not to hide their talents. Her message was simple. but powerful. Don't let others define your worth. Don't let a uniform hide who you really are. Never stop cultivating your dreams. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez sat in a modern office in Midtown Manhattan with a view of Central Park. She was the director of American Relations for Nakamura Technologies. She managed contracts worth millions, negotiated with CEOs of major companies, traveled between New York, San Francisco, and Tokyo. Her life was unrecognizable, but she hadn't forgotten where she came from. Every week she returned to the Grand Plaza Hotel, no longer in a blue uniform, but as a guest, to have coffee with her old colleagues. Richard had completely transformed the hotel's culture. Now every employee had an annual interview where they discussed not only work performance, but also aspirations, hidden talents, personal goals. The hotel had become famous not only for luxury, but for how it treated its staff. Sarah's story had become legend in the American hospitality industry. Other hotels started copying the model. Business journals wrote articles about how the plaza had discovered hidden talents among service staff. But the deepest impact was on ordinary people who saw hope in Sarah's story. How many people worked in jobs that didn't reflect their true talents? How many were invisible in others' eyes? How many had stopped cultivating their dreams? Sarah began receiving letters. Cleaning ladies from other hotels wanting to tell their stories, dishwashers with degrees, porters who spoke 5 languages, people who for years had been reduced to their uniform. Kenji, seeing this, created a foundation called Invisible Talents. The goal was to help people like Sarah be seen, find opportunities that reflected their true talents. The foundation offered scholarships for professional development courses, connected talented people with companies, organized events where service staff could network with managers and entrepreneurs. In 2 years, more than 300 people found new jobs thanks to the foundation. Former waiters became sommeliers in Michelin-starred restaurants. Former cleaning staff became translators for the United Nations. Former dishwashers opened their own businesses. Perhaps the most touching story was Richard's own. He'd started as a front desk clerk 40 years ago, slowly climbed the career ladder. But nobody had ever asked about his secret dream: writing. At 65, he published his first novel about the hidden lives of people working in luxury hotels, the stories guests never see. The book became a bestseller. In the dedication, Richard wrote, "To Sarah Martinez, who taught me that seeing people is the most important thing we can do." 3 years after that day in the 7th floor hallway, Sarah was invited to speak at an international hospitality conference in Las Vegas. The room was full of hotel directors, managers, chain owners from around the world. She stepped on stage with a mix of nervousness and excitement. She began her presentation with a simple question: how many of them truly knew the people who worked in their hotels? The silence was eloquent. Sarah continued, telling her story, not to evoke pity, but to illustrate a fundamental point. Every organization wastes talent if it looks at people only through the lens of their current position. She explained how, for 20 years, she'd cleaned rooms while speaking 3 Asian languages perfectly. How nobody had ever asked about her skills. How she'd been reduced to a blue uniform and a cart. But also, how a moment of crisis had revealed what had always been there. How necessity had broken down the wall of invisibility. She showed concrete data. Hotels that had implemented programs similar to the plazas had seen 40% reduction in staff turnover, 25% increase in customer satisfaction, 15% increase in productivity. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real part was human. It was dignity restored, talents recognized, dreams that started breathing again. She told of James, the dishwasher with an engineering degree who now managed maintenance for 3 hotels in the chain. Of Elena, the maid who spoke Russian and coordinated all services for Eastern European clients. Of Marcus, the porter who loved photography and was now the hotel's official photographer. Each story was testimony to the same principle. When you stop seeing people as functions and start seeing them as complete human beings, everyone wins. At the end of the presentation, there was long applause. But what followed was even more significant. Dozens of directors approached Sarah, asking for advice, sharing stories, admitting their blindness. One of them, an elderly man who managed a luxury hotel chain in California, said something that stayed with Sarah. For 35 years, he'd built his hotel's success, thinking luxury was marble, crystal, and impeccable service. But now he understood that true luxury was truly seeing the people who work for you. 5 years after that moment in the hallway, Sarah had become a respected figure in the international business world, but she hadn't forgotten her roots. Every year, on May 15th, the anniversary of the day she first spoke Japanese in that hotel, she returned to the Grand Plaza Hotel, not as a guest, but to work a shift as a cleaning lady. She wore the blue uniform, took the cart, cleaned the 7th-floor rooms. She explained it was important to remember. Remember humility. Remember how easy it is to become invisible. Remember that dignity doesn't depend on professional title. Richard, who had retired and now dedicated his time to writing and the Invisible Talents Foundation, always accompanied her. He too wore a uniform, worked beside her, remembered how much he'd learned the moment he finally saw Sarah. During one of these annual shifts, Sarah met a young cleaning woman recently hired. Her name was Sophia. She was 23, and while cleaning, she shyly told Sarah she'd studied design but hadn't found work in her field. Sarah smiled. She recognized herself 20 years earlier in that young woman. She spoke with Richard, who spoke with the new manager. Sophia was assigned to the room renovation project, where her design skills were finally utilized. It was the circle closing and reopening. Kenji, the Japanese billionaire who had inadvertently triggered everything, had become a dear friend of Sarah's. His father, Mr. Nakamura Sr., had written a memoir recounting how being saved by a cleaning lady had taught him the importance of never judging people by appearance. One day, during a visit to New York, Kenji told Sarah the Invisible Talents Foundation had now helped more than 1,000 people. But the most important thing wasn't the numbers, it was the cultural change. More and more companies were starting to look at their employees not as costs or functions, but as complex human beings with stories to discover. Sarah looked out the window toward Fifth Avenue and the Grand Plaza Hotel in the distance. She thought of that morning 5 years ago when she'd made the decision to cross that hallway, to break invisibility, to speak, a 30-second choice that had changed her life. But more important, it had changed how hundreds of companies saw their staff. That evening, she returned home to her apartment near Central Park. On the walls were her diplomas, finally framed with pride. There were also photos, with Kenji and his father, with Richard, with colleagues, with the hundreds of people who had found new opportunities. She sat at the desk and started writing. She decided to write a book, Invisible, the hidden stories behind the uniforms. She wanted to tell not only her story, but the stories of all the people she'd met. The stories nobody had ever asked to hear. Because the most important lesson was simple but profound. Everyone has a story. Everyone has talents. Everyone deserves to be seen. And sometimes, all it takes is one person who asks the right question, who truly looks, who sees the human being behind the uniform. Sarah began writing, fingers flying across the keyboard, telling stories of restored dignity and awakened dreams. And as she wrote, she smiled, knowing that each word was another bridge built between invisibility and recognition, between silence and voice, between what we seem to be and what we truly are. Like if you believe every person has hidden talents that deserve to be discovered, comment if you've ever seen someone judged by appearance instead of capabilities. Share this story of restored dignity and second chances. Subscribe for more stories proving people are always more than they seem. Sometimes the most important person in the room is the one everyone ignores. Sometimes the greatest talent is hidden under a uniform that nobody bothers to look beyond. And sometimes all it takes to change a life is being truly seen, even just for a moment. Thi.